So we've done our job. The rest is up to you.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Oh, do you want to do Q&A?
Yeah,
Okay,
sure.
so we're going to do Q&A for a few minutes. Yeah, and we'll have to repeat the questions. Oh, and I just want to say something before we do this, that in case it does come up, I think something that you and I share is I don't think hatred's too strong a word, a hatred for writers who lie. So if that ever happens to come up, that'd be fun to both take that on. Oh, sorry. Well, you missed I said some really interesting things, but don't worry about it. So you can go ahead and pick. I've been doing this all day, so you pick people. Basically, the question is, do I really believe that hunter-gatherer is the only level of technology that's sustainable? And it seems pretty clear to me that any way of life that is based on the use of non-renewable resources is by definition not sustainable. And likewise, any way of life that's based on the hyper-exploitation of renewable resources isn't sustainable. If every year there are fewer salmon than there were the year before, eventually there'll be none. And anybody who is not the head of the National Marine Fisheries Services can understand this. And I would then go a step further and say that any way of life that's based on the use of resources won't last. And what I mean by that is that so many indigenous people have said to me that the fundamental difference between Western and indigenous ways of being is that even the most open-minded Westerners perceive listening to the natural world as a metaphor. They perceive the world as consisting of resources to be exploited as opposed to other beings to enter into relationship with. And this is really crucial because how you perceive the world affects how you behave in the world. And there's a great line by a Canadian lumberman: when I look at trees, I see dollar bills. And if when you look at trees, you see dollar bills, you're going to treat them one way. If when you look at a bauxite mountain, you see dollar bills, rupees, you're going to treat it one way. If when I look at trees, I see trees, I'll treat it another way. If when I look at this particular tree, I see this particular tree, I'll treat it differently still. The same is true for fish, the same is true for bauxite mountains, the same is true for women. If when I look at women, I see orifices, I'm going to treat them one way. If when I look at women, I see women, I'll treat them another way. If when I look at this particular woman, I see this particular woman, I'll treat her differently still. I just saw a great example of this having to do with crabs. Just recently, or about a year ago, I live on a coastal town, and the harbor master, in the newspaper, the harbor master was saying why crabbers work so hard during crabbing season. And he said each crab is worth about $1.50. And he said, if you can imagine all sorts of envelopes lying all over the ground, each one has $1.50 in it, you'd be picking them up as fast as you can. And that's true, except crabs aren't actually envelopes filled with $1.50. Crabs are beings with lives as valuable to them as yours is to you and mine is to me, which doesn't mean that we can't eat them. Very, very quickly, I was doing a radio interview in Spokane, Washington several years ago, and the interviewer said, you know, Indians exploited salmon too. And I said, no, they didn't, they ate them. And he said, well, what's the difference? I said, well, they gave them respect for the spirit in exchange for the flesh. I knew that answer was kind of crap, but I'm a male, and so I'm required by law to answer every question that's asked of me. And so later on, that I had a long conversation with a tree that I had a long relationship with, and I said, what is the fundamental predator-prey relationship? And the tree gave me the answer, which is, if you consume the flesh of another, you take responsibility for the continuation of the other's community. So if I consume salmon from the Klamath River, I take responsibility for the continuation of the Klamath River salmon community. Not stewardship, which comes from the root styward, which is the ward of the pigsty, but instead responsibility, which comes from the root respondere, which means to give in return. So they give me their life, I give them my life. But back to the original point, no, the only level of technology that's sustainable is something that doesn't harm the land base at all. And eventually we will either by definition be living that way, or we won't be living at all. So no, the only ways of living that have been, and I want to say clearly that where I live is Tolowa land, and the Tolowa lived there for 12,500 years if you believe the myths of science. And if you believe the myths of the Tolowa, then they lived there since the beginning of time. And that's a long, long time. And the dominant culture has been there 180 years and the place is trashed. So yeah, the only level of technology, we can fantasize all we want, but the only level of technology that's sustainable is one that is not based on non-renewable resources, and not based on the hyper-exploitation of renewable resources.
The question is that the Occupy Wall Street movement has somehow excluded less privileged communities and people of color, black people, and so on. I think, you know, it's interesting that it's the reverse of what happens in a place like India, you know, where the privileged people are not involved in any movements unless they are very right-wing movements, you know. And so I think even the anti-war movement, I remember being here on a march and being interested in the fact that there were not that many black people or people of color involved, and even in this audience there aren't. And I mean, I'm not exactly the right person to answer that question, but I think perhaps it does have to do with maybe the fact that they don't even have the leisure to be able to be involved. You know, maybe, I don't know if I'm wrong about that, but like, for example, when you're trying to mobilize politically in a city in India, the people who are really at the bottom of the barrel have to work so hard night and day that they don't have time. They don't have time to listen to or go to political meetings or to be involved, and they are so fragile that they simply can't afford to. You know, the old days of workers' unions and labor unions and things, all that has been dismantled. So I don't know, maybe Derek, you have a better answer for this question here, about here.
No.
No?
But being a male, I'm going to say one thing, which is, there's a term for what you're talking about that I've heard is called primary emergency, where oftentimes if someone becomes an activist, if they have that leisure to become an activist, a lot of times they will go after the primary thing that is affecting them. So I thought about this a lot after I talked to John Stauber, who's a anti-public relations industry activist. He does great work, but he's a white male, and so in many ways he has the leisure to do that, as opposed to many times if a woman becomes an activist, many times one of her first issues might be men's violence against women. And that might be the place, that's not to say everybody, but that might be the first place someone goes. And so I just wonder where that question of primary emergencies fits into this. I think I'm just saying the same thing you did.
The other part was about advice for bridging multiple and diverse struggles. What advice might you give?
I'm very bad at giving advice, very bad. You know, because I would really like to know more about what's going on here before I gave advice. You know? Well, I think you know, this appearance of bottled water is such a terrible thing. You know, it's quite recent. I come from the state of Kerala, which is the southernmost part of India, where there's a huge agitation, quite successful one, against Coca-Cola, because they are, you know, obviously they have the money to dig the deepest bore wells, and they are pumping out the water to make bottled water, and all the farmers nearby, their farms are drying up because Coca-Cola is managing to pump out all the water. And just like cities will not enhance public transport so that people don't need to have cars. They don't clean the water system so that you can get you know, clean water in your tap to drink, so that everyone has to buy water in plastic bottles. I remember a few years ago there was a World Water Conference in The Hague, and I had just written this big piece on dams, and they'd asked me to come, but I didn't go initially. Then I read that the Indian government was sending a whole delegation there to justify and to ask for funds for building more dams. So I just kind of arrived there to wreck the proceedings as much as I could. And I was put on this panel, which was supposed to be a panel of writers, but I was the only writer. The others were all sort of writers of policies and things. And in the lobby of that meeting, there were all these, people who were dressed up as faucets, like inflatable faucets. And it was really funny. And the whole meeting was about the privatization of water, to sort of push for the privatization of water. And each of us had to introduce ourselves and say why we write about water. So there was an American man next to me. I don't remember his name, and I don't exactly remember what company he was working for, but whatever. He said, my name is Robert and I work for something, and I write about water because I'm paid to. And then he said, and I just want to say that God gave us the rivers, but he didn't put in the delivery systems. And for this, we need private enterprise. So I was up next and I said, I'm Arundhati Roy and I write about water because I'd be paid a great deal not to. So, and it was such a display of wanting to own, just wanting to own everything, just everything, and sell it and then resell it to us. And fundamentally, I think to own language, or maybe that's me and my primary emergency concern as a writer, but I feel that this is something we really need to pay attention to, because I remember at that meeting saying, I've never been in a room full of dead people for a long time, because as a writer, you spend your entire life and everything you have trying to minimize the distance between language and thought. You try to describe exactly what you're thinking or exactly what you're saying. And here you are in a room full of people who are doing exactly the opposite. They are devising a language with which to mask thought, and to use words to mean the opposite of what they mean. And to even retrieve our language is a battle.
I love that. And I want to go at this from a slightly different direction, which I think one of the most important things that anybody said today is something Lier said, and if anybody's going to write down one thing, this should be it, which is the task of an activist is not to navigate systems of oppressive authority with as much personal integrity as possible. The task of an activist is to take down those systems of oppressive authority. And I remember years ago, I was talking to an indigenous friend of mine, Jeanette Armstrong. She's an Okanagan activist and writer. And I was saying, oh my God, I feel so bad because I drive a car and so global warming is all my fault. And she said, take responsibility for what you do, but you didn't create car culture. And your job is not to minimize your own personal actions within it, but instead your job is to take down car culture. And another way to put all this is I wrote an essay a few years ago that got titled by the magazine, Forget Shorter Showers. And in there I talk about how, we always hear the world's running out of water, we've got to conserve water, got to take shorter showers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that does is displace responsibility onto persons instead of the whole system. And just the numbers are that more than 90% of water is used by agriculture and industry. And so if you take a shorter shower, that's fine. All it's going to do, though, is ruin your social life. The municipal golf courses use the same amount of water as municipal human beings. And so that's where the real action goes. And it's the same thing with trash. And I mean, I'm not saying that one should go ahead and attempt to minimize consumption however one can, but once again, that's not where the real action is. That if I reduce my trash production, the average person in the United States produces about 2,600 pounds of trash a year, somewhere in there. And so let's say I reduce that to 0. I don't buy anything with any packaging whatsoever. I wear my tennis shoes until they fall off my feet, and I repair my toaster, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's great. But the problem is that the average per capita production of trash in the United States is about 26 tons. And 97% of that is by agriculture and industry again. So we can reduce our personal consumption to 0, and that's not where the real action is. I want to say one more thing about that, which this just pisses me off about so many movies we see about environmental stuff. An Inconvenient Truth, they lay out all the problems, and at the very end, all the solutions are personal. They don't talk about the larger issues. Or Food, Inc. Food, Inc. pissed me off because the whole movie is really great about how the agricultural system is concentrated, it's unsustainable, it's exploitative, and then the solutions, one of the solutions is to buy yogurt from Walmart. It's like, so there's this disconnect at the end. So I think that there is altogether too much concern about personal purity within the environmental movement and sort of the left in general.
You should try living as an activist in the land of Gandhi, where unless you wear a loincloth and don't have sex and eat goat cheese, you're a bad person. So it's true that whole idea of you have to be a saint first and then be political is also a way of making sure that a lot of people are not political.
I was meeting with this group one time, it's the Audubon Expedition Institute. It's a bus that goes around the country with graduate students. And we're all having a conversation one day about whatever it is we're having a conversation. And this one person all of a sudden said, I feel really bad because I'm an activist and all this stuff, but I really like hockey. And so we went around the group and we did this sort of fun little exercise that we called Impure, which is each person said like something they like to do. And you couldn't go, oh, I'm so sorry I do this. Instead, it's like, you know what? I really like potato chips. And this one guy, this is great, I love this story. This guy's this long-time activist. He's been this great anti-corporate activist. Wonderful work. He's been doing wonderful work since before I was an activist. And his impure thing was he loves eating at fast food restaurants. He like hates the big corporations, but he likes eating at Burger King. It's just, oh well.
So the question is about the above ground and underground thing, and the idea being if there's a firewall between the above ground and the underground, then how do people who are underground get the basic support they need, whether it be safe houses or money and that sort of thing. And this is explained in the book Deep Green Resistance, but the basic idea is that there are very specific rules for crossing the firewall. So you can send information both ways, you can send things both ways, but it's tightly controlled. So a person who's underground would know, how to find support or a safe house from someone who's above ground maybe, but that person on the above ground doesn't know where to find the people underground, what their actual names are, so that the information is very tightly controlled in a way that continues to protect the information or protect the safety and identity of people underground. And then so it's the same when it goes the other way, like when an underground group sends a communique or something like that to a press office like the ELF press office, then all of their identifying information is stripped away. So it's sent anonymously and it's sent carefully. So that's how that works in general.
I want to say one thing about that, which is there's also models for this that already exist. And I mean, hello, we're in Northern California.